The auction ended on a Wednesday. Clouds hung low over the valley, heavy with sleet that had not yet fallen, but threatened to. Most folks stayed inside that morning. Those that didn't stood under the overhang at Sutter's barn, coats pulled tight, eyes fixed on the narrow pen where the woman and her 2 children stood, shoeless, rag-wrapped, silent as stone. One could have mistaken them for livestock if not for the girl's defiant stare and the boy's trembling hand clutching his mother's dress. No one bid at first, not because they didn't want to, but because no man wanted to be the one known for doing it. A widow from the Kansas flats, no husband, no kin, the children too young to work proper fields, too old to carry like bundles. The woman, Rebecca Goss, had that look about her that made people uncomfortable, not wild but hard, dried out, a frostbitten resolve behind her silence, like someone who had already survived more winters than she should have. The judge, a local man named Fillmore Hayes, banged his gavel against the crate and shouted above the wind, "Last lot, widow, age 29, 2 dependents, willing to work, no debts on record. County offers lodging in the Northern Bluff shelter. Starting bid." He didn't finish the sentence. A voice in the crowd hollered, "Give her the damn cave," and the place erupted in laughter. Someone else chimed in, "That hole ain't worth spit. Let her freeze in it." More laughter. Hayes, red-faced and flustered, pounded the crate again. "Order! That's a county asset. Shelter's shelter, damn it." But it was too late. The crowd had decided. The vote passed, not by ballot, but by laughter. And just like that, so Rebecca was handed a rusted key to a cave dug half into the North Ridge, a place so cold and dark that even the wolves hadn't nested there in years. They called it county lodging, but everyone knew it was the punishment spot, a gesture, a mockery, and Rebecca took it, no protest. No plea. She simply tucked the key into her threadbare coat, gathered her children, and walked barefoot through the icy mud toward the cave at the edge of nowhere. They reached it by nightfall. The cave's mouth yawned beneath an overhang of red shale, jagged like broken teeth. The path that led to it was choked with dry weeds and scattered with bone-pale rocks. Rebecca had to carry Thomas. He'd gone blue at the toes, and Abigail stumbled behind her, eyes wide but lips clamped shut, too proud to cry. Inside, the air smelled of earth and wet ash. At some point long ago, someone had tried to live there. The remnants were still scattered. Broken planks, a rusted stovepipe half buried in mud, 2 cracked jars of something pickled beyond recognition. It was maybe 20 feet deep, narrow. Wind funneled through the opening like a whistle. Rebecca stood in the center of it all, silent. She set Thomas down near the driest patch of earth, pulled Abigail close, and sat down cross-legged. She didn't cry. She didn't curse the sky or beg for a better fate. She just sat there, her back against cold stone, holding both children against her until their shivering calmed. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she listened to the wind scream through the trees above and the occasional far-off howl of something hungry. She made a list in her head, not of food, not of hope, but of what could burn. The cave had 2 advantages. It was stone and it was high. Stone meant insulation, not warmth, but less cold, and high meant dry. Most of the valley would flood in thaw season, but not this spot. It also meant wind, bitter, merciless wind that never stopped. But Rebecca had grown up with wind. By the second morning, her fingers were raw from scraping the walls. She found a seam in the stone that bled condensation, caught it with a bent tin plate. She dug a small trench near the front of the cave to channel runoff out, away from where the children slept. She found bits of old cloth in the rubble and stitched them together with horsehair she pulled from an old bridle she'd kept from Kansas. Each hour became a war against the next. The stovepipe was useless without a firebox, but she buried the lower end of it and used the chimney as a flue for a dirt pit she dug. She couldn't use it often, not without smoke giving her away, but she lined it with dry moss and old tin and prayed it would draw. She stole what she could: bark from trees, half-rotten planks from an abandoned fence. She traded one of her husband's buttons for half a candle, and she never begged, not once. She only went into town twice in those first 2 weeks. Once for salt, once for nails. She offered sewing. They gave her stares, not cruel, not kind, just that blank look men give women they've written off. And every time she returned, she made the cave more hers. One night she found old boards by the creek and dragged them up the ridge on her back. She split them with a rock, one after another, long into the night. She nailed them across the cave entrance in a crisscross, not tight, but enough to blunt the wind. She left a gap for the pipe and covered it with an old feed sack. It whistled, but it no longer screamed. And inside, when the fire held, it grew almost warm. Thomas stopped coughing by the 3rd week. Abigail started humming again, softly, tunelessly, the kind of sound that meant her belly wasn't entirely empty and her toes weren't entirely frozen. That was when the visitors started. They didn't knock, they didn't speak, just shadows at the edge of the ridge. Men, sometimes two, sometimes three, watching, leaning on fence posts. One threw a bottle once, missed by a mile. Another left a rabbit carcass on a rock. She didn't touch it. They weren't there to help. They were there to remind her that she was supposed to fail. But winter came early, and not softly. The storm hit in the last week of October, 2 months early. It came from the west, riding low and violent. Sleet turned to ice before it hit the ground. Roofs caved in, roads vanished, fences snapped under the weight of wind-carried snow. Even the judge's barn collapsed. By mid-November, 10 men were dead, and the only place still standing was the worthless cave on the northern bluff. Rebecca didn't open her doors. She didn't wave lanterns or shout for neighbors. She just stoked her little moss-lined fire pit, boiled water from her condensation tin, and wrapped her children in the stitched-together cloths she'd padded with creek mud insulation. And for the first time since arriving, she slept. Not deeply, not without the knife in her hand, but she slept. The wind had changed. Not its sound. Wind always howled on that ridge, but its weight. It had grown heavy with silence, thick and dull, like even the trees had stopped creaking. Rebecca woke not to the chill, nor a sound, but to the stillness. Her eyes opened in the dark, and her hand instinctively searched the floor until it found the old knife handle beneath her shawl. Abigail lay beside her, curled tightly, her little body warm now from the shared heat of packed wool, pine bedding, and the rocks she'd heated in the coals before sleep. Thomas snored soft, a dry rasp in his throat, but no more fever. Then came the thud, not loud, not urgent, but close. She didn't rise immediately. She listened, counted, 1, 2, another thud, soft scrape. Something or someone was outside the cave. Man just past the wooden crosshatch she'd made of broken planks and stripped cedar boughs. For a moment she thought it might be snow sliding off the ledge, but it repeated with too much rhythm, like the foot of a man too tired to knock but too stubborn to leave. She stood, pulled the shawl around her, and stepped quietly toward the entrance. Her fingers moved over the slats like a memory, touching each beam she'd nailed in with her own hand. She peered through a crack. It was Owen Sutter. Of all the men in town, he was the one she had expected to show up last. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't, but because he was proud. Too proud to come crawling to the cave they'd mocked her for. But there he stood, his shoulders stooped, snow packed into the brim of his hat, the sleeves of his coat crusted with ice. He held something in his arms. "Ma'am," he rasped, not raising his eyes. "We heard you still had fire." Rebecca didn't answer. "I got my sister's boy," he said, finally lifting his gaze. "And I ain't asking for charity. Just a warm patch of rock till the worst passes." Rebecca studied the boy in his arms. No older than Thomas, pale, unmoving. She stepped back, opened the gate without a word, and let them in. By dawn, there were 3 more. Sarah Ann Deacon, whose cabin had buckled under the ice crust at midnight. Her hands were black with frostbite. Her baby wrapped in what looked like nothing more than a feed sack, breathing shallow. Then the boy who'd brought her, no more than 13, with a bloodied gash down his cheek and no shoes. Then 2 others, a pair of trappers from upstream who claimed they'd seen smoke. Neither asked for permission. So they just sat close to the rock pit, nodded once at Rebecca, and offered their only blanket to the children. She didn't stop them. By nightfall, there were 11 people in that cave. They huddled shoulder to shoulder, knees drawn tight, heads low. It was no longer a shelter. It was a body, a single, breathing body of half-frozen humans, bound not by kindness but by survival. And Rebecca, she didn't speak much, but she moved through them like stone through water, quiet, certain, a hand on a shoulder. A pot of boiled bark passed to the weakest. She rationed without comment. She arranged stones in a way that gave everyone at least some heat. She showed them how to plug the draft gaps with mud from a bucket she'd dug out by hand. She wrapped Thomas in the coat of the trapper who never asked for it back. When one of the babies died 2 nights later, she dug the grave alone, her arms trembling in snow up to her thighs, while the others watched in silence from the cave mouth. No one laughed anymore. On the 7th night, as snow buried the town roads, and the mercantile roof collapsed under the ice, Rebecca sat by the entrance with a rag-wrapped lantern. The oil had run low days ago, but she fed it bits of bear fat she'd saved in a cracked mason jar. Her breath steamed in the cold, and for the first time since Kansas, she allowed herself to close her eyes while not standing watch. She dreamt of fire, not the little pit she'd built with scraps and soot, but fire that licked high into night sky, orange and alive. A fire that breathed and cracked and danced. A fire in a hearth surrounded by stone walls, not a cave, but a home. And when she woke, she knew what she had to do. The floor of the cave sloped downward near the rear, where water had once carved out soft channels in the stone. Rebecca had noted it weeks ago, but hadn't dared tamper, afraid the structure might collapse. But now the need outweighed fear. With the trapper's help, his name was Cole, she learned, they cleared the back wall with a flat stone they'd sharpened against an iron skillet. They worked in silence, trading shifts to save their strength. Rebecca traced the path of moisture with her fingers, following it deeper into the curve of the cave. There, hidden behind a curtain of calcite, they found a hollow pocket in the wall, dry, tight, but deep enough to lie down in. It could be insulated. It could hold heat. They stripped bark from the inner cedar limbs, mixed it with creek mud and moss, and lined the chamber. The fire pit was moved closer. Rocks were stacked to reflect heat inward. They called it the hot room, though it never grew more than lukewarm. But to frostbitten skin, it felt like the hearth in her dream. Children slept there first, then the old, then the sick. Rebecca never used it herself. She stayed near the entrance, always watching, always listening. By mid-December, word had spread. People from further down the valley, men who hadn't spoken to her since auction day, began appearing in ones and twos. Some brought food, most brought nothing but stories and frost. One man offered silver if she'd let his wife in. She refused the silver and let the wife in anyway. Another offered her a rifle. She took that, not for the threat, but for the game. She and Cole began hunting in shifts, snares, tracks in the snow. Once they caught a half-starved fox and turned it into stew. It was the boy, Nathan, who first called the place the Warm Hole. Others picked up the name, and still no one laughed. The town hall burned down just before Christmas. No one knew how. Some whispered it was punishment for what they'd done to her. Others figured it was just the chimney giving out, but the records were lost. All the names, all the deeds, gone. The cave didn't burn. It couldn't. It was too humble for fire, too stubborn. And Rebecca, in her quiet way, became something like a mayor, not because she asked, but because every decision passed through her, every bit of meat rationed, every stone rearranged. When someone new arrived, it was her they looked to, not the preacher, not the sheriff, her. One night the judge came, Fillmore Hayes. Same man who'd auctioned her like cattle. He didn't say a word. He stood at the edge of the firelight, hat in hand, face lowered like a boy who knew better than to speak out of turn. She let him in, handed him a crust of bread. He took it, ate it, and slept by the entrance, same as she did. Then came the thaw. It didn't arrive gently. The snow melted too fast. Rivers surged. The valley flooded. Every cabin below the ridgeline took water. Some collapsed. Some floated clean off their footings. The general store was gutted. The church steps washed out. Only the cave remained, dry, warm, alive. By February, over 30 souls had passed through it. Not all stayed. Some returned to rebuild, some vanished, but none forgot. And when spring finally bloomed, when birdsong returned and green crept back into the bones of the trees, it was Rebecca they thanked. Some brought bread, some brought tools. One woman offered her a horse. She refused them all and simply said, "It's time to plant." The thaw didn't bring peace. It brought rot, the kind that rose up from underneath floorboards, bloated sacks of corn, split open barrels, and green-black slime that crept over everything once white. Cabin walls wept water. The ground grew soft and sour. Chickens drowned in their own coops. The men who had mocked Rebecca all winter now struggled to find anything left that hadn't turned to mush. The cave didn't flood, not once. Rebecca's worthless hole in the rock sat above the flood line by 20 feet. The water never touched it. The air inside stayed dry, the bedding crisp, and the salted meat undisturbed. Even the stacked roots, packed in moss and dirt-lined tins, had held through the storm. By March, it was more than just survival. It was proof. Proof that she hadn't just endured the winter by accident. She had won it, and people didn't know what to do with that. It started with silence. Awkward nods from the townsfolk when she passed. Quick glances down. Men fiddling with hats. Women looking past her children like they weren't there. But not out of cruelty, out of something colder, shame. Rebecca had outlasted them. That was the truth. And some couldn't bear it. She never rubbed it in, never spoke of what happened in the cave, nor of the things she'd done to keep them all alive. She didn't even correct the stories. When folks whispered that Cole had planned it all, or that the trappers had reinforced the roof, she let them talk, because the truth wasn't something she needed to say. It was carved into the rock, and it walked beside her with every step. But not all of them looked away. Some remembered. Cole stayed by her side, not as a husband, not as a suitor, but as a quiet shadow who helped where needed. He didn't talk much, didn't ask for anything, but if wood needed chopping or snares needed checking, he was there. One afternoon in late March, he brought her a shovel, a real one, not the broken-handled one she'd used all winter, and set it beside the cave mouth without a word. She looked at it for a long while before lifting it. Together they dug. She had no title deed, no claim. The cave wasn't hers on paper, but the town had burned, and the records with it. And no man was eager to argue that the woman who'd fed their children through the freeze wasn't entitled to a patch of earth, so she made it permanent. They cleared the brush around the cave mouth, dug steps into the slope. Rebecca borrowed a hammer from the blacksmith and built a frame, doorway, then lintel, then hand-hewn door from scraps she scavenged from the washed-out schoolhouse. A door meant something. A hole in a rock was shelter. But a door said home. Inside, they carved niches in the wall, set stones in the floor to make it level. Rebecca dragged broken shelves from the wreckage downtown and mounted them with iron nails heated in a fire and hammered in with a stone. She patched the roof hole with waxed cloth and tar from the pitch pine coal found upstream. She built a second fire pit further back. Saya insulated the hot room and dug a runoff trench out the rear of the cave to divert water down the ridge. Each night the children slept deeper. Each morning they woke with color returning to their cheeks. And slowly, with the snow now gone, and the town licking its wounds, people began to climb the ridge, not in desperation, but with purpose. The first was Clara Murdoch. Her husband had died of fever that winter, left her with nothing but 3 children and a mule too lame to ride. She stood at the cave's mouth in her patched dress and crooked bonnet, a sack of withered potatoes in her hand. "I heard you knew how to keep things from rotting," she said. "I'll trade potatoes for a root cellar space." 1 week. Rebecca didn't say yes or no, just stepped aside. Clara left the sack and returned the next day with 3 more. A week became a month, then 2. By midsummer, Clara was tending a small patch of turnips beside the cave entrance. She didn't ask to stay, she just did, and Rebecca didn't stop her. Then came the children, boys who hadn't eaten since the spring floods, girls whose mothers had taken ill from drinking creek water. They came alone, or in pairs, or clinging to the skirts of sisters barely older than themselves. One by one they were fed, not feasted. Rebecca had no luxuries to give, but fed well enough to last. Bread made of coarse flour and crushed nuts, broth from boiled marrow bones, salted bark tea to ease coughs. She never turned one away, not once. She built bunks into the wall, stacked high like ship berths. She carved names into the beam above each. Abigail and Thomas each had their spot. So did Clara's children. So did Nathan, the trapper's son, and Ruth, the girl with frostbitten fingers who'd never spoken a word since the baby died that December. They called it the Hollow. The town called it something else, Rebecca's place. And again, no one laughed. By July, they had a system. Cole and Nathan hunted. Clara cooked. Rebecca oversaw the root cellar, now expanded into a narrow split behind the cave wall where the temperature never rose above 40. She used buried jars filled with ash and snowmelt to preserve greens, packed dried meat in wax-sealed tins. She even taught Thomas how to check for spoilage, how to smell for sourness, to prod for softness. The child who had once nearly frozen to death on the first walk up the ridge now measured temperatures with his hand against stone. Abigail planted rosemary near the entrance. It grew stubbornly, defiant against the wind. She said the smell kept flies away. Rebecca didn't argue, but trouble always rides behind peace. The land was still contested. The town council, newly reformed, wanted to re-establish property lines. They wanted to resettle what had been lost. And some men, seeing Rebecca's cave now wrapped in order and purpose, saw opportunity instead of failure. The first notice came pinned to a tree. It bore the seal of the county. Someone had dug it out of the ash pile, tried to re-stamp legitimacy into it. "All county lodgings to be reassessed. Return property by August 1st. Rebecca read it, tore it down, and burned it in the fire. But she knew it wouldn't end with paper. They came on foot, 3 men, one a surveyor, the others from town. They didn't knock. Just walked into the clearing where Abigail was hanging wet wool over a makeshift line. "Property belongs to the county," the tall one said. "We'll be taking it back. You'll be compensated." Rebecca stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes flat. "Where will you put the children?" she asked. The man shifted. "They'll be looked after." "By who?" He didn't answer. Rebecca stepped forward, past the door, down the 2 dugout steps into the sun. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the rosemary. "There are 34 people fed from this place," she said. "You want it, you take it, but you take them with it." Behind her, Thomas stepped forward, holding the long-handled shovel Cole had sharpened. Clara emerged next, apron dusted with flour, face set like flint. Then came Ruth, then Nathan, then Cole, each silent, not defiant, but ready. The 3 men looked at the line of faces, then at each other. They left without a word. The next day, the surveyor's wagon was found overturned in the creek. No one claimed responsibility, no one investigated, and no one came back. That fall, Rebecca's Hollow was marked on the new map with a black dot and the words, "Community Shelter." It wasn't legal, but it was permanent, and permanence, on the frontier, was everything. By the next spring, the cave was no longer a cave. It was a homestead, the kind drawn by hand on the corner of a map with notes scrawled beside it. Safe, good water, Rock holds heat, the kind of place whispered about at river crossings and in washed-out saloons where the word shelter had started meaning more than a roof. Rebecca didn't change, not much. Her shoulders still sloped from long days of work. Her eyes still searched the horizon every morning as if winter might sneak back early. But the quiet weight she'd carried, the one she bore from the auction block all the way up the ridge, had shifted. She still didn't speak often. She didn't need to. Now, others spoke for her. That spring, the first real road was cut to the hollow, not by government, not by a council vote, but by the hands of the very same people who had once voted her off with laughter. Men with saws, boys with shovels, women walking behind them clearing rocks. They never asked Rebecca's permission. They didn't need to. The trail they followed was the one her bare feet had first carved in the mud that October. They widened it, reinforced it with split logs, made it fit for a cart. And on the first day, a wagon made it all the way up, clattering and groaning under the weight of salvaged bricks and crates of nails. Abigail and Thomas stood at the cave's lip, hands shielding their eyes, mouths open in awe. They had never seen so much iron in one place. Cole, leaning on the same long-handled shovel from winter, said only, "You'll want a chimney next." And Rebecca, without turning her head, replied, "Two." The brick oven came first. Cole built the frame, but it was Ruth who laid the stones. Her frost-bitten fingers, stiff and blackened at the tips, moved like they remembered a different life. She never spoke, but every time the fire caught in the brick belly, a faint smile crossed her lips. Once the oven was in, the meals changed. Flatbread, baked yams, stewed beans with salted meat and a crisped edge. The smell traveled down the ridge and reached the town before any messenger could. Then came the barn. It wasn't large, just 4 walls of rough pine and a sloped roof lashed together with tarred rope, but it was high enough to keep goats dry and strong enough to hold feed. The goats were traded for 2 young does from a family who'd lost their plow horse in the flood. Rebecca gave them 3 months' food from the root cellar in return. Some called it foolish, but when milk began to flow, and Clara's youngest put on weight for the first time in months, no one doubted her again. That summer they took in the O'Hara boys, 5 of them, all under 13. Their mother had died, birthing the youngest, and their father had taken to drink and rifle barrels. They came up the ridge barefoot, dragging a cart of rags and corn husks. Eyes hollow, Rebecca took them in like she had the rest, quietly, without ceremony. She handed them bread, showed them where the stream was, and gave them bunks made from woven rope and dried moss. It was Thomas who showed them how to seal cracks in the stone with fat and soot. Abigail showed them how to press mud into bricks using the old crate molds. By the end of the week, the boys had found their rhythm. By the end of the month, they were digging out a second storage chamber beside the root cellar. People said, half joking, that Rebecca was building a village. She said nothing, but she didn't laugh either. Then came the storm, not of snow, but of fire. Late August, the heat clung to everything like a second skin, the grass dry as kindling, the wind sharp and restless. It started 3 miles west, near the Greaves property, where a lantern tipped over in a chicken coop. It spread fast, too fast. The town panicked. Buckets were thrown, wells drained, roofs doused in wet burlap. But the fire moved like a hungry beast, crawling across the ground, leaping from tree to tree. Men screamed, horses bolted. The sky turned black at noon. Rebecca saw the smoke at dawn. She didn't wait. By mid-morning, she had the cave sealed. The children were moved to the deepest chamber, the goats penned behind a double wall of rock and soaked canvas. Every soul inside was accounted for. The fire hit the ridge by evening, and the hollow held. The wind beat against the stone. Ash rained like snow. Sparks leapt across the slope. But the mouth of the cave was closed tight, lined with mud and pine and wet cloth so thick it smoked without catching. For 12 hours, the sky glowed orange. But inside, it was cool, still, silent. When dawn came and the sky cleared, the town lay blackened. Half the cabins were gone. 2 entire families were missing. The chapel was nothing but charred beams. And again, the only place untouched was Rebecca's cave. She didn't speak of the fire, she didn't boast, but others did, and soon her name reached farther than the valley. Traders from across the pass came asking if she sold goods. A newspaper man from Denver rode up the ridge and asked for a story. She turned him away. He still published it, called her the cave widow of Winter Ridge. People sent letters. Some brought food, others tools. A few asked to send their children. Rebecca didn't reply, but she built more beds. And when the first frost of the new year dusted the ridge, it wasn't fear in the air, it was preparation. The hollow was ready, and this time, so was the town. That winter, the storm came later. It was harsher, winds that snapped trees, ice that crept beneath floorboards. It wasn't just a freeze, it was a reckoning, but no one died, because no one faced it alone. Families moved into the hollow before the snows hit. They brought preserves, firewood, books, soap. They cooked together, they patched clothes. They told stories. The fire pit never went cold. Rebecca added a chimney above the hot room. Using salvaged pipe, it vented heat across the back chamber. With stone walls reflecting it and the moss insulation in place, the cave stayed nearly 45 degrees, even in the dead of night. The children no longer shivered. They played. They laughed. Thomas turned 9. Abigail turned 11. Rebecca didn't mark the days, but she remembered. Late that winter, a girl gave birth in the hollow, not Rebecca. Her name was May, just 16. The father was gone, the mother too sick to help. It happened at night, during a sleet storm that cut the ridge in half. No one could reach the town. Rebecca did it all, laid out the cloth, boiled the water, held May's hand and whispered, not words, not comfort, but strength, the kind born from cold and silence and fireless nights. The baby came fast, screaming, red, alive, and the cave heard new cries, not of fear, but of beginning. The last fire of the season burned slow. It was March again, 1 full year since the auction, a year since the cracked key had been dropped into her hand like a joke, since the town had laughed and turned their backs, since she'd walked barefoot through sleet with her 2 children wrapped in burlap and silence. Now she stirred a pot of boiled root stew with a carved wooden ladle. The scent filled the hollow. Children moved about behind her, stacking, kindling, sweeping stone floors with pine boughs. The goats bleated in the barn. The newborn, May's boy, was sleeping in a basket stuffed with wool beside the fire. His breath was steady, warm, safe. Outside, wind still bit the air, but it was a dying breath. The snow was crusty, thinning. The tips of green had begun poking through the lower hills again, life returning in whispers. Rebecca didn't smile. Not exactly, but her shoulders weren't as heavy. The council came again that week, this time with respect. No papers, no seals, just boots muddy from the climb and eyes lowered in the proper way. They asked her to speak at the town gathering. They wanted her voice on the new charter. They offered land, official title, a patch of ridge marked in ink, her name on the record, Rebecca Goss, landholder. She didn't give them an answer right away. She stirred the stew, she passed bowls. She gave the goat boy, Will, a look that meant, fetch more wood. He ran to do it. Only then did she speak. I'll sign, she said, but not as owner. The men frowned, confused. She lifted her eyes. This place belongs to those who need it. She let that sit in the air, heavy, honest. If you want to write that down, you can. The youngest of the council nodded slowly. We will. The marker was placed a week later. Stone, local, etched by hand. It sat at the edge of the trail leading up to the hollow, where the frost thawed first and the rosemary still grew. It read, "The hollow shelter given freely, heat, stone, food, and courage. Founded by Rebecca Goss in the winter of the great storm, all are welcome." There was no ceremony, but the town came, even the judge. They stood in silence, some with heads bowed, others just watching the wind move the grass around the stone. It wasn't a funeral, it was a beginning. That spring, Rebecca took the children down into town for the first time in months, not to beg, not to barter, but to build. The schoolhouse had half collapsed in the flood. The teacher had left. The town asked if she might bring someone from the hollow down each week to teach reading, maybe show how to store food in dry clay, how to build vents that didn't steal heat. Rebecca didn't say yes. She simply walked back up the ridge. The next morning, Abigail and Ruth walked down with slates and lessons written in charcoal. They taught under a tree stump. On a hill, a dozen children sat cross-legged listening. By summer there were 50. Cole asked her once, only once, if she'd consider leaving, going further west, taking a wagon, starting over somewhere without the memory of what had been done to her. Rebecca had stared at the fire for a long time before replying. I didn't survive to run, that was all. He never asked again. The years went on. The hollow changed, grew. The stone was carved deeper, a second chimney, a side tunnel for water storage, even a small forge run by the O'Hara boys who'd grown into strong men with soot-lined hands. People came from other counties, from far ridges, from as far as Nebraska and the eastern slope of the Rockies. Some came to stay, others came to learn, and a few came just to touch the stone, just to see if the stories were real, and always. Rebecca was there, quiet, tired, but unshakable. She never called herself a founder, never claimed wisdom. But when a mother came with frostbitten hands and a baby too quiet, it was Rebecca who held the child first. It was Rebecca who lit the fire. One summer, a rider came from Fort Laramie, military coat, tired horse, a letter tucked in oilcloth. He had orders. They wanted her cave, said it was strategically valuable. Rebecca read the letter once, handed it back. You'll need to freeze us out, she said. The soldier left with nothing but stories. The army never came. Years later, long after the children had grown, and coal had passed, and the ridge had become a settlement with stone paths and drying houses, and a forge, and even a tiny postbox, the townsfolk built a second marker. This one stood taller, granite. Black lettering carved clean. They called it the Heartstone, but Rebecca never visited it. She didn't need to. Her legacy wasn't carved in granite. It was carved in hands that no longer trembled in the cold, in children who no longer flinched at the wind, in fire that never went out. The last winter of her life was the warmest, not because the storms were kind, but because the hollow held heat now. Real heat, stored in double walls, circulated with buried channels and dry stone ducts. Designs she had learned, tested, built, taught. She didn't spend her last days in bed. She sat by the fire, shawl drawn up, bread crust in hand, watching May's boy, now 12, teach the youngest how to line a food jar with moss. When her heart gave out in the early hours of a snow-laced morning, she was sitting upright, not afraid, still watching. They buried her at the ridge edge, not in the valley, not in town, not beneath stone, but within it. They widened the hollow one last time, dug into the dry seam of the deepest chamber, set her wrapped body into the rock, piled earth and cedar boughs, burned rosemary for the scent, and sealed the stone. On the wall outside, someone scratched a final message with a nail and a steady hand. You gave fire to the frozen. You gave silence its strength. You were not worthless. You were the hollow.